Someone destroyed Danny Ramirez's entire life, and he invited them to his apartment for dinner every week for 7 years. But we'll get to that. First, you need to understand what Danny built. Not the career, not the apartment, not the photography exhibition that was 5 days away from changing everything he had ever worked for. No, what you need to understand is the man. Because the cruelest thing about what was coming for Danny wasn't what it took from him. It was what it targeted. See, Danny Ramirez was the kind of person who paid attention, who noticed things most people walked right past. The way light landed on a fire escape at 6 in the morning, the way a stranger's face changed right before they started crying in public, the way someone's laugh sounded different when they were actually happy versus when they were performing it. He was a photojournalist, 29 years old, working out a third-floor apartment in a city that hummed and rattled and never quite went dark. His walls were covered in photographs of the world outside, strangers, rooftops, rain-slicked streets at midnight. But in the bottom drawer of his desk, there was one album he kept private, and every photograph inside, it was the same person. Her name was Emily Lee. They had met 7 years ago in a college art class, over terrible coffee and a shared contempt for a professor who talked too much about passion and not enough about craft. She was an architecture student with neat handwriting and wild ambitions. He was a photography student with a second-hand camera and a quiet intensity that most people found either magnetic or unsettling, depending on how threatened they were by someone who actually listened when you spoke. They became friends the way certain people do, not gradually, but all at once, like a door opening in a wall you didn't know had one. By Christmas of their first year, they had exchanged friendship bracelets at her family's bakery, the whole place smelling of cinnamon and warm bread, Emily's mother watching them from behind the counter with an expression neither of them thought to interpret until much later. By year 2, Danny had spent 3 nights in a hospital waiting room, so Emily wouldn't face her mother's illness alone. By year 5, they were living in the same apartment building, sharing a distinctive coffee mug with number 1 best friend printed on the side, and Danny had quietly accepted the fact that he was in love with a woman who looked at him like a brother. He never told her. He told his leather journal instead. Page after page of small, careful observations. Year 3. She laughed at something I said, and I didn't hear the rest of the conversation. Year 5. She canceled dinner and I was angry, and I didn't know how to explain why. Year 6. Her father was in the hospital, and she took time off work to be with me, and I realized I would set fire to everything I owned if it meant she'd never have to be alone in a waiting room. He documented it all, and he kept it locked in his desk drawer, and he told himself that protecting what they had was worth more than risking everything on feelings she didn't seem to share. He was wrong about that, but he didn't know it yet. What Danny also didn't know, what he had absolutely no reason to suspect on the morning he sat in a police station waiting room holding a formal legal notice, was that 3 weeks earlier, a man named Jake Gallagher had walked into his apartment with a key Emily had given him, found that leather journal in his desk drawer, and read every single word inside it. Jake was Emily's fiancé, quiet, well-dressed, professionally connected, and beneath all of that, calculating in a way that never showed on the surface until it was already too late. He had stood in Danny's apartment with that journal in his hands and turned pages slowly, reading years of someone else's devotion, and when he was done, he had not put it back. He had made a phone call, and the person who answered that call, the person who had said, after a pause that lasted just a little too long, "Okay, I'll handle it," was Lisa Chun, Emily's older sister, the woman Danny trusted almost as much as he trusted Emily herself. By the time Danny sat in that waiting room, a fabricated plagiarism complaint had already been filed against him with his magazine's editorial board. A ghost photographer, an entirely fictional person with manufactured social media history and doctored metadata, had been constructed from scratch to serve as the supposed victim. Forged emails, false timestamps, a legal consultant connected to Jake's firm, pulling strings Danny didn't even know existed. The complaint was clean, professional, and devastating. And the exhibition Danny had spent 3 years building, the one that was supposed to finally prove to himself and to the world that his work deserved to be seen, was 5 days away from being canceled. He still thought it was a mistake. He still thought it was fixable. He still thought the people closest to him were safe. That is the thing about betrayal. When it comes from inside the house, it doesn't announce itself. It arrives wearing a familiar face, speaking in a familiar voice, saying all the right things, while underneath it, the foundation you spent years standing on is already gone. Danny folded the legal notice, tucked it into his jacket, walked out of that waiting room into the sharp spring morning, already mentally cataloging the evidence he would need, already trusting the people who were already watching him fall. And somewhere across the city, Jake Gallagher was having coffee with Lisa Chun, Emily's sister, Danny's confidant, the woman he was about to call for help, and they were both very, very calm. So here's the question I want you to sit with as this story moves forward, and think about it carefully, because the answer matters more than you might expect. If the person you trusted most with your pain is the same person helping to cause it, at what point does loyalty become the most dangerous thing you own? Danny Ramirez woke up on a Tuesday morning believing he still had a fighting chance. That was the first mistake. Not because he lacked evidence. Not because he lacked intelligence or instinct or the kind of quiet, focused determination that had carried him from a blue-collar Midwestern childhood all the way to the threshold of a career-defining moment. No, the mistake wasn't in his capabilities. The mistake was in his assumptions. Because Danny Ramirez had spent 29 years building a worldview around a single operating principle, that the people who loved you were the people you could trust. That loyalty meant something, that the inner circle was a safe place. And on that Tuesday morning, with a legal notice on his kitchen table and 5 days until the exhibition that was supposed to change everything, he picked up his phone and called the two people closest to him, Marco, his roommate, and Lisa, Emily's sister, and he told them everything. He had no way of knowing that one of those calls was already being reported to the enemy before he'd even hung up. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Because the cruelest part of this story isn't the moment Danny found out. The cruelest part is everything that happened before he did. Every moment he spent fighting blind, trusting the wrong people, coming agonizingly close to the truth, and then walking away from it because someone he loved pointed him in the wrong direction. And to understand how that works, you have to understand something about betrayal that most people don't want to accept. It is almost never dramatic. It almost never announces itself with raised voices or obvious lies. The most effective betrayal in the world looks exactly like loyalty. It sounds like concern. It offers you tea and tells you everything is going to be fine. And while you're sitting there, relieved and grateful, the knife is already between your ribs, and the hand holding it belongs to someone who smiled at you across a birthday dinner last week. That was Lisa Chen's particular genius. And the terrifying thing is, she didn't even think of herself as a villain. So let's go back to the beginning of the week. Let's watch it happen in real time. The way a car accident happens in real time. Slowly enough to see every detail. Fast enough that you can't stop it. Danny arrived at his legal consultant's office at 9 in the morning with a folder of documentation that would have impressed most people. He had spent the previous 48 hours cataloging every photograph in his archive, dates, negatives, file signatures, publication records, building the kind of meticulous evidence trail that a photojournalist learns to maintain not because they expect to need it, but because good documentation is simply professional discipline. He laid it all out across the consultant's desk with quiet confidence. 7 years of original work, every image traceable to its source, every timestamp legitimate. His case, on paper, was airtight. The consultant reviewed it carefully. Then she looked up, and the expression on her face was not the one Danny expected. "Your documentation is solid," she said. But the complaint isn't really about the documentation. Danny leaned forward. "What do you mean?" "Whoever filed this," she said, sliding a printed page across the desk, "didn't just allege plagiarism. They submitted what appears to be counter-evidence. Emails between you and the photographer you allegedly stole from, time-stamped, formatted correctly, signed with your email address." Danny stared at the page. "Those emails don't exist. I've never communicated with this person." "I know," she said, "but they're very good forgeries. And the gallery's board isn't equipped to distinguish between a genuine email and a fabricated one without a forensic analysis, which takes time. And your exhibition opens in 5 days. There it was. That was the architecture of the trap. It wasn't designed to convict him. It was designed to delay him, to create enough professional uncertainty that the gallery would pull the exhibition rather than risk legal exposure. And by the time the forgeries were exposed, the damage would already be done. Danny would be the photographer whose show was canceled under a plagiarism cloud. In the industry he was trying to break into, that reputation didn't wash off. Not easily. Not quickly. And whoever had designed this understood that with a precision that made Danny's stomach turn. He drove home slowly, the city moving past him in its usual indifferent way. People on sidewalks, coffee cups in hands, the ordinary machinery of everyone else's Tuesday morning grinding on without any awareness of what was collapsing inside one car on one unremarkable street. He parked, sat for a moment, and then reached for his phone and called Lisa. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and immediate. "Danny, how did it go? What did they say?" And here is where you have to pay attention, because what Danny told Lisa in that phone call, the specific details about the forged emails, the forensic analysis timeline, the gallery's 48-hour window to confirm or cancel, those details were not public. They were not in the complaint. They were not known to anyone except Danny, his consultant, and now Lisa. And within 2 hours of that phone call, Jake Gallagher's attorney had submitted a second wave of evidence to gallery's board that referenced, specifically, surgically, the very vulnerabilities Danny had described to Lisa on the phone. Danny didn't know that yet. He wouldn't know it for several more days. But you know it right now. And that is the thing I need you to sit with as this story continues. The knowledge of what Danny doesn't know, the awareness of the trap closing around him in real time, the helpless, infuriating clarity of watching someone you're rooting for walk directly into the damage being prepared for them. Because that feeling, that specific gut-level frustration, is exactly what Danny was about to experience for the rest of the week, except from inside. Lisa told him not to say anything to Emily yet. She has enough on her plate, Lisa said. The Lisbon decision is stressing her out. Let me ask around quietly on my end. I have contacts at a few galleries. I might be able to find out if anyone knows who filed this. Don't worry her until we know more. Danny said thank you. He meant it. He hung up the phone and felt, for the first time since opening that legal notice, something approaching relief. That relief was the second mistake. Across town, Emily Lee was sitting in a restaurant across a white tablecloth from Jake Gallagher, listening to him describe their future with the calm, practiced confidence of a man who believed the board was already set and the outcome already decided. Lisbon is the right move, Jake was saying. The commission is prestigious. It's the kind of project that puts your name on a completely different tier. And we could go together. Fresh start. New city. It makes sense, Emily. Logistically, professionally, all of it. Emily was turning her fork over and over in her hands, a habit she had when her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was thinking about Danny. She had been thinking about Danny since Monday morning, when she had noticed, in a way that 7 years of close friendship builds a particular kind of radar, that something in him had shifted. He'd been distracted at coffee, quiet in a way that felt effortful rather than natural. She had asked him directly, "What's wrong?" And he had smiled in that specific way he had, warm, deflecting, deeply unconvincing to anyone who knew him well, and said, "Work stuff. It's fine." It was not fine. Emily knew it was not fine. But she also had her own storm of decisions bearing down on her, and Jake was sitting across from her right now, presenting one of them as already resolved, and she had learned, too slowly. She was beginning to realize that Jake had a way of making decisions on her behalf and framing them as logistics. "I haven't decided about Lisbon," she said. Jake smiled. "I know. I just want to know that I've thought it through, and I think it's the right call for both of us." Emily looked at him across the table. Something in the texture of his confidence struck her as slightly wrong. Not in a way she could name, not in a way she had enough information to interrogate, just a faint, persistent wrongness, like a note played slightly flat in an otherwise convincing performance. She filed away and said nothing. She texted Danny on the walk home, "Are you okay? Something feels off with you." He replied 40 minutes later, "Tell me about it at the exhibition. I want you front row." She read that and smiled despite herself. She wrote back, "Obviously front row. Where else?" Neither of them knew how close they were, in that small exchange, to the thing that was coming. Now here's where the story picks up speed. Because while Danny was fighting complaining, Emily was navigating Jake's careful maneuvering, and Lisa was playing both sides with an increasingly uncomfortable precision, Marco Perez was doing something none of them were doing. He was paying attention. Marco had been Danny's roommate for 4 years and his friend for longer, and whatever his reputation, as the group's resident comic relief might suggest, Marco was not stupid. He had watched Danny's mood for 3 days, the sleeplessness, the obsessive archive reviewing, the way Danny would sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence and stare at nothing for a moment, recalibrating something internal, and he had drawn his own quiet conclusions. On Wednesday evening, while Danny was at a meeting with his editor, Marco sat down at the kitchen table with Danny's copy of the complaint, a laptop, and the focused energy of someone who had decided to be useful. He started with a photographer, the one Danny allegedly stole from, a name, a website, a modest social media presence with a portfolio of street photography, and a bio that read like 100 other emerging photographer bios. Marco went through the portfolio methodically, reverse-searching images, checking EXIF data on the publicly accessible files, cross-referencing gallery tags and location metadata. It took him 2 hours. And at the end of 2 hours, Marco leaned back in his chair and said, quietly to the empty kitchen, "This person doesn't exist." The photographs in the portfolio had been taken in at least 4 different cities, according to their embedded metadata. But the social media account showed no travel. The oldest post was 14 months old, which meant this photographer had apparently sprung into existence fully formed less than a year and a half ago, with no prior exhibition history, no college program records, no previous web footprint of any kind. The website domain had been registered anonymously through a privacy service. And the style of the photography, Marco was not a visual artist, but he had lived with Danny long enough to develop an eye, was weirdly consistent, too consistent, like someone had fed a reference set into a system and asked it to produce variations. When Danny came home, Marco was still at the kitchen table. "Sit down," Marco said. "I need to show you something." Danny sat. Marco walked him through it. The reverse image searches, the metadata inconsistencies, the suspiciously recent origin of the account. Danny's expression shifted as he absorbed it. The grief and exhaustion that had been living in his face for 3 days began, slowly, carefully, to be replaced by something else, something harder and colder and considerably more focused. Someone built this photographer from scratch. Danny said, "To frame me." 14 months ago, Marco said, which means this wasn't improvised. Someone planned this. Someone who knew about your exhibition timeline well enough in advance to construct a fake identity, seed it with content, and wait for the right moment. Danny stared at the laptop screen. Who knew about the exhibition timeline 14 months ago? Marco looked at him steadily and said nothing. The answer was not a long list of names. "This is the moment I want you to think about something. Put yourself in Danny's position for a second. Not just a professional crisis, not just a ticking clock, but the specific psychological landscape of discovering that what came for you was not random, was not impersonal, was not a stranger's opportunism. It was planned. It was built. Somebody sat down and engineered the destruction of something you spent years creating, piece by piece, with patience and precision and access that only exists when you've been trusted. How does that feel? What does that do to the way you look at the people around you? Because here's what that knowledge does to Danny Ramirez. It doesn't make him explosive. It doesn't make him accusatory. It makes him very, very quiet. And people who mistake Danny's quietness for passivity have always made the same error. They confuse stillness with absence. Danny goes still the way a camera goes still before it captures something. The processing is happening. You just can't see it from the outside yet. He went through the timeline. 14 months ago, who knew about the exhibition in its early stages? His editor, obviously, but his editor had nothing to gain from destroying it, and Danny had known him for 6 years. Marco was sitting across from him right now, having just handed him the only real lead in the entire case. Emily, she knew everything. She always knew everything, but the thought arrived and was dismissed so quickly it barely registered as a thought. And then there was a quiet, persistent knock of a name he had been circling without approaching directly. Jake, who had been in and out of Emily's life for years. Jake, who had a key to the apartment building. Jake, who had been present at enough group dinners and social events to know Danny's professional timeline, his archive process, his exhibition schedule. Jake, who was calm in a way that always struck Danny as slightly performative, the kind of calm that isn't the absence of strong feeling, but is instead the very careful management of it. But knowing a name and having proof were two entirely different things. And Danny had spent enough time in journalism to understand that suspicion without evidence was not a story. It was just noise. He was going to need something real. The following morning, Danny's editor called him into the office. He sat across a wide mahogany desk from a man he respected and watched that man's face do the careful work of delivering bad news with professional composure. The editorial board had reviewed the complaint and the subsequent evidence submission. The gallery, under legal counsel's advice, had exercised its cancellation clause. The exhibition was off. Danny said nothing for a moment. The silence in the room was the particular silence of something ending. "Is it permanent?" he asked. "That depends on the investigation timeline," his editor said. "If you can produce counter-evidence sufficient to trigger a formal review, the gallery's board has indicated they would reconsider. But Danny, that process takes weeks. Minimum. Weeks." The exhibition had been scheduled for 5 days from now. Weeks meant it was gone, not just postponed, but gone in every meaningful sense. The press attention, the industry momentum, the precise convergence of timing and readiness that had made this exhibition the right moment, all of it dissipating into a procedural timeline. Danny stood up, shook his editor's hand, thanked him for the call, walked out into the building's lobby and stood for a moment in particular, specific silence a man who has just watched something irreplaceable disappear. His phone buzzed. A text from Lisa. "How did it go? Anything new?" Danny looked at the text for a long moment. Then he typed back, "Nothing yet. Still working on it." He did not tell her about the canceled exhibition. He did not tell her about Marco's discovery. He put his phone in his pocket and walked out into the afternoon. And something had changed. Not dramatically, not visibly from the outside, but something in the architecture of Danny's trust had quietly, fundamentally shifted. He couldn't explain it yet. He didn't have the evidence to justify it yet. It was just a feeling, the specific, uncomfortable feeling of a man who had just started asking himself the question he had been avoiding. Who benefits from my silence? Ask yourself that question for a moment. Who benefits from Danny not knowing the truth? Not just Jake. Because Jake's motivation is clear enough, jealousy sharpened into calculation, love threatened and responding with destruction. But Jake needed access. Jake needed inside information. Jake needed someone who knew Danny's professional details, Danny's timeline, Danny's vulnerabilities. Someone Danny would go to instinctively when the damage started landing. Someone whose misdirection Danny would accept without question, because the alternative was simply unthinkable. Now hold that question while the story takes you somewhere you don't want to go. That evening, Marco found something else. It was almost incidental, a thread he pulled while following a different trail entirely. He had been trying to trace the legal consultant connected to Jake's firm, cross-referencing public court records with the complaint filing. And in the process, he found something in Danny's own phone records that stopped him cold. He knocked on Danny's bedroom door. At 11 at night, Danny was still awake. He was always still awake. The insomnia that had plagued him for years working at full power in the context of a week like this one. "I need to show you something else," Marco said. He looked uncomfortable in a way that was not characteristic of him. Marco did uncomfortable humor. Marco did uncomfortable situations with a kind of brash, deflecting energy. This was different. This was Marco being genuinely, carefully gentle, in the way people are gentle when they're about to hand you something that will hurt. He showed Danny the phone records. The call Danny had made to Lisa on Monday morning. The one where he had described the forged emails and the 48-hour gallery window. He then showed Danny the timestamp on Jake's attorney's second evidence submission to the gallery's board. 2 hours after that call. He then showed Danny what that submission contained. A point-by-point response to the specific vulnerabilities Danny had described to Lisa. Vulnerabilities that were not in the complaint, not in any public document, known only to Danny, his consultant, and the person he called immediately afterward. Danny read it twice. Then he set the paper down on his desk, with a very small, very controlled movement. "Lisa," he said. It wasn't a question. Marco nodded. "I'm sorry, man." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved through its late-night rhythms. A distant train, voices somewhere below on the street, the ordinary hum of a world that did not pause for private devastation. Danny did not rage. He did not break anything. He sat in his desk chair with particular stillness of a man reorganizing everything he thought he knew about the last several days, rereading every conversation, every reassurance, every gentle misdirection, now translated to the correct lens. The warmth Lisa had offered him on Monday morning, that reliable, sisterly concern, was now visible for what it was: a mechanism, a way to stay close to what he knew, to manage what he would do, to buy time for a plan that was already in motion. And here is where I need you to understand something about Lisa Chun before you simply write her off as a villain and move on. Because the truth, the infuriating, complicated truth, is that Lisa did not do this out of malice. She did not lie awake at night, savoring Danny's destruction. She had convinced herself, with the quiet persistence of someone who needs to believe in her own justifications, that she was doing what was best for her sister. That Danny's feelings for Emily were a kind of instability. That Jake, for all his careful manipulation, offered Emily the kind of settled, practical future that Lisa had decided Emily needed. That disrupting that future, even in the service of something true, would hurt Emily more than it helped her. Lisa was wrong, catastrophically wrong, but she was not a monster. She was a person who had made a terrible choice from a place of genuine, misguided love, and had then found herself unable to reverse it without admitting everything. And the further in she got, the more impossible the admission became. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains it. And in this story, understanding the difference between those two things is going to matter. Danny slept that night. Not well and not for long, but he slept. And when he woke up at 5 a.m. with the city outside his windows still dark and the apartment quiet around him, something had settled in him that had not been there the night before. The grief was still present. The sense of loss, professional, personal. The specific devastation of discovering that betrayal had been sitting at his own kitchen table. Was not gone and would not be gone for a long time. But underneath it, or maybe alongside it, something else had arrived. Something quiet and purposeful, and if you were paying attention to Danny's face in that early morning light, just slightly dangerous. He opened his laptop. He looked at the foreign correspondent job offer that had been sitting in his inbox for 2 weeks, patiently waiting for him to stop hesitating. He read it again, carefully. He did not accept it. He did not delete it. He thought about it in a way he had not thought about it before. Not as an escape, not as a retreat, but as a variable in a larger equation. Then he opened a new document and began writing. Not a letter, not a complaint. A list, methodical, detailed, structured the way a journalist structures a story. Beginning with what he knew, moving to what he could prove, then to what he needed to find, and finally to what he planned to do about all of it. He wrote for 2 hours. When he stopped, he had something that was not yet a strategy but was a skeleton of one. He called Marco into the kitchen at 7. He made coffee, real coffee, not the instant version that had been their domestic shorthand for years. He set 2 mugs on the table, and he said, very calmly and very specifically, "I need a digital forensics contact, someone who can run a full metadata analysis on the forged emails and produce documentation that will hold up in front of an editorial board." Marco looked at him. "I know someone. He did contract work for a newspaper last year. He's good." "Good," Danny said. "I also need the gallery director's direct contact information, not through my editor. Directly." Marco nodded slowly, reading the room. "What are you thinking?" Danny wrapped both hands around his coffee mug and looked out the kitchen window at the city, coming slowly into morning. "I'm thinking," he said, "that they believe the board is set. That Jake believes the board is set." He paused. Let them keep believing that. He called Emily that afternoon. Not to tell her. Not yet. He called her because he needed to hear her voice and because there was a specific, quiet torture in knowing what he knew and not being able to say it. Not because he was protecting himself, but because the moment he said it, Emily would be pulled into a devastation she was not prepared for, directed at her own sister, and Danny was not going to do that to her. without having something real to offer alongside the truth. He was not going to walk into Emily Lee's life and set it on fire and then hand her a pile of ash. He was going to have something better than that. He just needed a few more days. She picked up on the second ring and said immediately, "Okay, I know you said to wait for the exhibition, but you sound terrible in your text, and I need you to tell me what's actually going on." Danny laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and genuine, and it surprised him. "I'm fine," he said. "I promise. There's some work stuff I'm dealing with, but I have a handle on it." A pause on her end. He could hear the precise quality of her skepticism, the specific silence Emily produced when she was deciding whether to push. Then, "Danny, I know the difference between you having a handle on something and you telling me you have a handle on something." "I know," he said. "Trust me for a few more days. I'll explain everything at the exhibition." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," she said finally, "but I want you to know that whatever it is, you don't have to handle alone." He held the phone against his ear for a moment after she said that and felt something complicated move through him. Gratitude and grief, and a very specific kind of longing that had nothing to do with romance, and everything to do with the particular pain of loving someone who doesn't yet know how much you need them. "I know," he said. "I'll see you soon." He hung up, sat with the silence of the apartment around him, then stood up and went back to work. Marco's contact came through the next morning. The digital forensics analysis of the forged emails took 11 hours and produced a 40-page document that was, in the language of technical assessment, devastating. The metadata was impossible. The timestamps reflected a server pathway that had not been operational during the dates indicated. The file signatures contained embedded code consistent with a document fabrication tool. The email addresses appeared legitimate on the surface, but contained a single-character substitution in the domain that would not be visible in standard email clients. It was good work, genuinely sophisticated, the kind of fabrication that would fool most people, including most editorial boards. Without a forensic eye, it would not, however, fool the right journalist with the right documentation. Danny read the report twice, carefully. Then he made 3 phone calls. The first was to his legal consultant, who received the forensic report and said, with audible relief, "This is what we needed." The second was to the gallery director, directly, as he had planned, bypassing the board and the legal process entirely. He requested a private meeting. He told the director he had forensic documentation proving the complaint was fabricated. He did not demand reinstatement. He offered evidence and asked for 20 minutes of the director's time. The director, to his credit, said yes. The third call was to a senior editor at a national publication, someone Danny had worked with briefly 2 years earlier on a regional story, someone who had said, in parting, "You're the real thing. Call me when you have something worth showing." Danny called. He explained what had happened, the fabrication, the motive, the documentation, the professional targeting. The editor listened without interrupting. When Danny finished, the editor said, "When can you have materials to me?" "Tomorrow," Danny said. "Then we should talk about timing." Danny said, "I was thinking the night of the exhibition, if the gallery reinstates it." A pause. Then the editor said, "That's good storytelling." Danny almost smiled. "I learn from good people." He hung up, looked around the kitchen. Marco was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, watching him with a particular expression of someone witnessing a person they love turn a corner. "So," Marco said, "we're actually doing this." "We're actually doing this," Danny said. "And this is the moment I need you to hold. Because the power in this story has been in one direction for the entirety of Act 2. Jake has been moving pieces. Lisa has been feeding information. The gallery board has been making decisions. And Danny has been on the receiving end of all of it, fighting blind, trusting the wrong people, losing ground he spent years building. Every beat of this middle act has been the long, grinding experience of watching a good person absorb damage they don't deserve, unable to stop it, unable to understand the full shape of it, unable to do anything except survive each new blow and keep moving. But survival was not the same thing as passivity. And what Jake Gallagher and Lisa Chun had fundamentally miscalculated, the error at the center of their entire plan, was this. They had looked at Danny Ramirez's gentleness and mistaken it for weakness. They had looked at his patience and mistaken it for surrender. They had watched him spend 7 years loving a woman in silence and decided that silence was a defining characteristic of who he was. They were wrong. Danny Ramirez was a man who paid attention, who noticed things, who documented everything, who had spent his entire career turning the unseen into the visible, pulling the hidden into the light, holding a frame steady until the truth inside it became undeniable. He was not going to fold. He was not going to disappear. He was not going to accept the story someone else had written about him. He was going to write his own ending. And Jake Gallagher, comfortable in his restaurant across town, satisfied with a plan he believed had already succeeded, already looking at Lisbon ticket confirmations and thinking about a future he had decided to build on someone else's wreckage, had absolutely no idea what was coming for him. Which raises a question that should be keeping you up right now. The question that sits at the exact center of everything the story is building toward. When a man who has been silent for 7 years finally decides to speak, in front of the right people with the right evidence, at exactly the right moment, how loud do you think that voice is going to be? Stay with me. Here's the thing about a trap that has been built with patience and precision. It requires the same patience and precision to spring it. And Danny Ramirez had spent 7 years being patient. So let's talk about what happened in the 48 hours before everything changed. Not the dramatic version. Not the version where the music swells and the hero strides forward in slow motion while the world realigns itself around his righteousness. The real version. The quiet version. The version that looks, from the outside, like nothing is happening at all, because that is exactly what Danny needed Jake and Lisa to believe. That nothing was happening, that the board was set, the game was over, and Danny Ramirez was somewhere in a darkened apartment absorbing his losses like a man who has accepted defeat. He was not in a darkened apartment. He was at the gallery director's private office at 8 in the morning, 2 days before the exhibition was originally scheduled to open, sitting across a desk from a woman named Catherine Marsh, who had been running that gallery for 11 years and had a finely developed instinct for her when she was being used as someone else's instrument. Danny placed a forensic report on her desk. 40 pages. Metadata analysis. File signature documentation. Server pathway evidence. The complete technical dismantling of every fabricated piece of evidence in the complaint. He did not speak while she read. He had learned, in years of photojournalism, that silence was often more persuasive than argument, that the truth, given sufficient space, tended to make its own case. Catherine Marsh read for 20 minutes. Then she closed the report and looked at Danny across her desk with an expression that was equal parts professional composure and genuine, controlled fury. Someone built an entire fictional identity to frame you, she said. 14 months ago, Danny said, which means the plan predates any public announcement of the exhibition. Whoever did this had access to my professional timeline before it was public knowledge. She was quiet for a moment. Do you know who? Danny looked at her steadily. I have strong evidence pointing to a specific individual. I'd rather present that evidence in a context where it can't be quietly managed, which is why I'm asking for something specific from you. She leaned back slightly. What are you asking for? Reinstate the exhibition, he said. Not publicly. Not yet. Just internally. Hold the date. And give me access to the gallery space the night before the original opening for what I want to describe as a private press preview. He paused. I'll take care of the rest. Catherine Marsh studied him for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and made a call to the gallery's legal team that lasted approximately 4 minutes. When she hung up, she looked at Danny with something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. The complaint is formally dismissed as of this morning, she said. Your exhibition is reinstated, and you have your press preview. Danny stood, shook her hand, and walked out into the morning. He did not celebrate. He had one more piece to place before this board was actually set. Now here's the question I want you to think about as we move into the final hours of the story, because it matters more than it might seem on the surface. When justice finally arrives, what form do you want to take? Do you want punishment, clean, public, unambiguous? Do you want humiliation, the kind that leaves no room for reinterpretation? Or do you want something more complicated than either of those things? Something that hurts in the right places and heals in the right places simultaneously? Because Danny Ramirez, to his considerable credit, had thought about this question, and his answer was not what Jake Gallagher was expecting. The day before the press preview, Danny did two things that had nothing to do with evidence or strategy or the careful positioning of a reversal. He called his younger sister, the one he had been supporting in quiet, guilty financial atonement for years, the one he had not truly spoken to in far too long. The conversation was halting at first, the way all honest conversations are when they are returning from a long absence. She asked him how he was. He told her. Not the edited version, not the version that protected her from worry, but the actual truth, the complaint, the fabrication, the people involved. She listened without interrupting, which surprised him. And when he finished, she said something that stayed with him for the rest of that day and the day after. She said, "You always protected everyone from knowing when things were hard for you. You thought that was kindness. It wasn't. It was just loneliness dressed up as strength." Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know. Do better," she said. And somehow, from her, that was also an expression of love. He sent her a photograph after he hung up. Not a digital file, but a print already addressed and stamped. One he had taken their child at home on his last visit to the Midwest. The front porch in Winterlight. Their father's truck in the driveway. The specific, irreplaceable geography of a beginning. It was not an apology. It was something more useful than an apology. It was a door reopened. The second thing he did was call Marco into the kitchen and tell him everything. The full plan, the full timeline, every piece of what was about to happen. Marco listened without his usual commentary. When Danny finished, Marco looked at him for a long moment and said, "You know what the wildest part of this is?" Danny said, "What?" "You're not even doing this to hurt him." Marco said, "You're doing this because the truth deserves to be seen. That's it. That's the whole reason." Danny said nothing. "Man," Marco said quietly, "you're a better person than I would be." Danny almost smiled. "Don't tell anyone. You'll ruin my reputation." The invitations went out that evening. Handwritten notes. Because Danny was, at his core, a man who understood that the medium carried its own message, and a handwritten note said something about intention that a text message never could. The guest list was precise. His editor and two members of the editorial board. Two journalists from national publications, including the senior editor he had called 2 days earlier, the gallery director. 3 photographers from Danny's professional network, whose opinions carried genuine industry weight. And, warmly, personally, in the specific language of a man who had no idea what he knew, Jake Gallagher and Lisa Chun, each invited separately, each giving the impression of a small, intimate gathering of close friends before the official opening. He also sent a simple text to Emily. "Tomorrow night, the gallery. I need you to be there. Not front row, just there." Emily read it twice, picked up the phone to call him, then put it back down. She had been watching Danny's carefully maintained composure for a week and had a persistent, uneasy sense of standing outside a room where something enormous was happening just beyond the door. She texted back, "I'll be there." Then she sat at her drafting table for a long time, not drawing anything, just thinking about the particular quality of Danny's voice on the phone 3 days ago, the way it had been warm and steady, and just barely, almost imperceptibly, carrying something underneath it that she could not name. Across town, Jake received his invitation and showed it to no one. He read it twice, found nothing threatening in its language, and decided that attending was the smart play. That being present at a gathering of Danny's professional contacts, composed and supportive, was precisely the posture of a man with nothing to hide. He had been told the exhibition was canceled. He had been told the complaint was proceeding through normal channels. He had, in his own assessment, already won. He put on a jacket. He checked his reflection. He went. The gallery was warm and low-lit when the guests arrived, the kind of atmospheric lighting that makes a room feel simultaneously intimate and significant. Walls hung with Danny's photographs, the city made beautiful and complicated by a particular way of seeing it. There was wine. There was quiet jazz from a small speaker in the corner. There were perhaps 25 people in the room, small enough to feel private, large enough to feel like a real occasion. Jake arrived with composed ease of a man at a social event he expects to be inconsequential. He shook hands with people he recognized, accepted a glass of wine, and found a position near the back of the room with a clear sight line to the door. Old habit. The positioning of a man who likes to see who's coming and going. Lisa arrived separately, navigating the room with the careful energy of someone managing multiple layers of awareness simultaneously. She found Danny almost immediately. He greeted her warmly, smiled, thanked her for coming. She looked into his face and found nothing there that should have alarmed her. Nothing sharp or cold or accusatory. Just Danny. Steady, warm, paying attention. She told herself she was fine. She was not fine, but she didn't know that yet. Emily arrived last, slipping in quietly, scanning the room until she found Marco, who materialized at her elbow with a glass of water and said, simply, "Stay close. And when he starts talking, don't react, just watch." Emily looked at Marco with an expression that was equal parts alarm and the dawning understanding that she had been right all week, that there was something enormous happening just beyond the door, and the door was about to open. Danny took the floor. He didn't use a microphone. The room was small enough and quiet enough that his voice carried without one, and there was something in that choice, the human scale of it, the deliberate intimacy, that immediately drew the room's attention in a way that amplification would have diluted. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Most of you were told this was a press preview before the official opening. That's partially true. But there's something I need to address first, because the opening almost didn't happen. And the reason it almost didn't happen is a story that some people in this room are going to find surprising. A very small shift in the room's atmosphere. The particular quality of attention that arrives when people sense they are about to hear something real." Danny looked at the gallery director, who gave a single small nod. He turned to the display screens mounted along the back wall of the gallery, the ones Catherine Marsh had arranged, quietly and without fanfare, to be connected to a laptop running the forensic report. 6 days ago, Danny said, a plagiarism complaint was filed against me with my editorial board and this gallery's board of directors. The complaint alleged that the photographs in this exhibition were stolen from another photographer. He paused. That photographer does not exist. The screen behind him populated with the forensic documentation, the metadata analysis, the fabricated timeline, the server pathway evidence, the single-character email substitution. Clean, visual, undeniable. Danny walked through it methodically, not with anger, not with performance, with the same precise, factual clarity he brought to every story he had ever told, because that was what this was, a story, and he was going to tell it correctly. He showed the fabricated social media account and its 14-month creation date. He showed the connection between the legal consultant who filed the complaint and a specific law firm. He showed the law firm's connection to a specific client. And then he said the name, Jake Gallagher. The room absorbed this. 25 people, 2 journalists with notebooks, an editorial board, and a gallery director, all of them now looking at the man standing near the back wall with a glass of wine he had not touched in the last 4 minutes. Jake's face did something complicated. It went through composed, then careful, then calculating, and then, in the space of approximately 3 seconds, it arrived at the particular expression of a man who has realized, too late, that the room he walked into was not the room he was invited to. He said, "That's a serious accusation." Danny said, "Yes, it is, which is why I have 40 pages of forensic documentation to support it." He looked at Jake with an expression that was not triumphant and not cold, just steady and clear and utterly without performance. "You built a fictional photographer to destroy my career. You forged emails. You filed a fraudulent complaint. And you did it because you found my journal." Silence. "You found out that I loved Emily," Danny said. "And instead of talking to her about it, instead of trusting her to make her own decisions, you decided to remove me from the equation entirely. You didn't think she deserved to choose. You thought you'd choose for her." Something shifted in the room at that, not among the journalists, not among the board members. It was simply 2 people on a rooftop in the quiet that comes after a long storm, close enough that the city below them barely mattered, holding on to each other with the specific, careful tenderness of people who understand, bone deep, how close they came to losing this. The string lights glowed. The city hummed. Somewhere below, Marco looked up at the rooftop from the gallery doorway, registered what he was seeing, and walked back inside with the dignified composure of a man who deserved significant credit for how gracefully he handled that moment. He poured himself a glass of wine. He raised it slightly toward the ceiling. That was enough. In the days that followed, the world rearranged itself around the new truth in the small, practical ways that life always does. Jake Gallagher, facing formal documentation of fraud submitted to his law firm's managing partners by Danny's legal consultant, resigned quietly from his position before the matter could be escalated further. He left the city. He sent Emily a single message that said, simply, "I hope you find what you're looking for." She suspected, reading it, that he had known for longer than he admitted that she already had. The exhibition opened to the public 3 days later. It ran for 6 weeks and received a full feature in the national publication Danny had called during the darkest part of the previous week. Not about the fabricated complaint, but about the work itself, the photographs, the 7 years of city seen through one man's particular, attentive eye. The review described them as images made by someone who understood that the most important things are usually happening just beneath the visible surface, and that the photographer's job is simply to be patient enough to wait for the light. Danny read that line and thought about 7 years of patience. He thought about all the ways that patience had cost him and all the ways it had, in the end, quietly served him. He clipped the review and put it in the leather album, not in the private section, not in the drawer. On the shelf, visible, Emily kept her position at the architecture firm. She deferred the Lisbon Commission, not permanently. She told Danny just for now. There was a project she was more interested in. He asked what project. She showed him her sketch pad, a floor plan of a small apartment, 2 chairs at a table, a bookshelf built for 2 people's worth of books and albums and accumulated years. He looked at it for a long moment. "Is this us?" he asked. "This has always been us," she said. "I just finally drew it." Lisa came to the exhibition on its second night, alone, early, before the crowd arrived. She stood in front of each photograph for a long time. At the end of the gallery, Danny's rooftop portrait of Emily, the one from the party night, titled simply Year 7, stopped her for several minutes. When she found Danny near the entrance afterward, she didn't say anything elaborate. She just said, "It's beautiful work." He said, "Thank you." They stood together for a moment in the quiet of the gallery before the evening crowd arrived. It was not repaired, not fully, not yet, but it was not broken in a way that couldn't eventually become something more honest than what it had been before. Some things have to fracture before they can be rebuilt correctly. The final image of this story is not a grand gesture. It is not an airport declaration or a rain-soaked rooftop reunion or any of the dramatic signposts that romantic stories use to mark their endings. It is this: a Sunday morning early. The city soft and gray outside the windows of a small apartment that is in the process of becoming 2 people's shared space. Books being integrated, photographs being hung, the domestic architecture of a life being redesigned from scratch. Danny is at the kitchen table with his coffee and his leather album open in front of him, not reviewing it this time, but adding to it. A new photograph slipped into the final sleeve that sat empty for 7 years. Emily asleep on the couch, morning light on her face, completely unaware of the camera, completely herself. He pins it in with the careful attention of a man who understands that this is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a much longer one, and who is, for the first time in as long as he can remember, genuinely, quietly, completely unafraid of what comes next. Emily stirs, opens her eyes, sees him across the room with the album. "Are you photographing me while I sleep?" She says, voice still thick with mourning. "Documenting." He says, "There's a difference." She throws a pillow at him. He photographs that too. The city outside hums on. The coffee cools. The morning comes into the window in long, golden bars of light. And that is where we leave them, not at the end of something, but at the beginning. 2 people who spent 7 years standing at the edge of their own story, afraid to step in, who almost lost each other to silence and pride, in particular, painful human habit of protecting yourself from the very thing you need most, who chose, finally and fully and without reservation, to step in. Now I want to hear from you, because this story only exists in its full form in conversation. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been Danny? Have you ever spent years loving someone in silence, convincing yourself that protecting the friendship was worth more than risking the truth, and then watch someone else almost make that decision for you by destroying what you were too afraid to reach for? Or were you Emily, the person who had a love right in front of them every single day and couldn't see it until it was almost gone? Drop your answer below. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone standing right now at the edge of 7 years of silence, carrying a leather album of feelings they haven't said out loud yet, share this with them, not as a hint, just as a reminder that the truth, however long it waits, eventually finds the light. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming, and every single one of them is about the moments that change everything. Don't miss the next one.